Well, kia ora and welcome everyone to Co-op Leader Conversations. I'm Saya Wallach, CEO of Cooperative Business New Zealand, the peak body for co-ops, mutuals and member-owned businesses. One of the fascinating shifts happening in the cooperative sector right now is the role technology is playing in how members engage with the ownership process itself. Now, many New Zealand co-ops were built decades ago, and our research has shown that the average cooperative lasts up to 5 times longer than a regular investor-owned company. And maybe these systems had been designed for paper share registers, for annual meetings, and for that kind of more physical share trading processes. But members today expect something different: transparency, accessibility, and the ability to interact with the ownership in real time. Sharesies business has been working in this space, including through its acquisition of Orchestra, a platform several of our co-op members already use to manage shareholder registers and comms, and through new partnerships with large cooperatives like Fonterra and LIC to enable simpler share trading. So today we're exploring what happens when cooperative membership meets modern technology. And Susannah Batley from Sharesies Business joins me to talk about that. Susannah, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be on.
So Sharesies is really well known for helping New Zealanders access investments. And Sharesies Business is now working with companies and co-ops themselves. So can you tell us a little bit about what prompted you to take that step?
Yeah, well, back when Sharesies started, it was started with a very simple idea all around democratising and helping everyday Kiwis access investments. And really it's about growing their wealth and empowering that wealth development. But as we grew, it was very clear that wealth creation doesn't just sit on one side of the market. It also sits with the companies, the organisations themselves, and the relationship those organisations have with the people who back them or the people that are important to them. And so it was around sort of a few years ago, I think around 2022, we started thinking more deeply about that connection. You know, if we care about people growing their wealth, then we should also care about how the businesses engage with their shareholders and their broader stakeholders. And that's really where Sharesies Business, the B2B arm, started. And actually, one of the first places we focused was employee share schemes, because they're a really powerful example of stakeholder alignment. Employees are both helping build the company and then through share ownership, sharing in that value that they create. And so then the question became, how do we help companies create really great experiences for those people? And then really from there, the idea broadened and it became not just about employee ownership and more about how companies connect with the people who believe in them, their wider stakeholders. And that's what naturally led us to working with cooperatives. And when we started talking with organisations like Fonterra that you mentioned, it was really fascinating. Like, as I learned more about the co-op model, you just realise how powerful that alignment is. Fonterra cares deeply about its shareholders, but of course those shareholders are also its suppliers. So they're literally at the heart of the business. And that's what I really love about that co-op model, is that the incentives are so beautifully aligned. It's the people creating the value are the same people that benefit from it. And actually, one other thing that I found interesting at Sharesies, as we're really broadening wealth and broadening ownership, is that you see, I guess, maybe smaller, but that dynamic emerge elsewhere. So on Sharesies, we have tens of thousands of investors who own companies like Contact Energy, Meridian, Spark in New Zealand, and many of them are also customers of those businesses.
Yeah,
so you're starting to see those. Yeah, exactly. Like, you're starting to see those overlaps between investors, customers, employees, suppliers, because at the end of the day, companies or organisations are people, people are people. And so the more that you broaden that ownership out, the more overlaps you're going to get. But I still would say that cooperatives take that idea to its purest form. And that's why I would say the co-op sector has been quite a natural and really exciting extension of what we've been doing.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And as you said, co-ops really do have that strong culture of member ownership, and intergenerational member ownership as well. So do you think from what you've experienced so far, particularly I guess with Fonterra, and with LIC, do you see that the technology itself has a potential to strengthen that relationship with the cooperative and the member? Or do you think it's more about making it easier and a simpler process?
I mean, I'd say that, when we talk about that cooperative advantage, and as you say, a big part of it is that deep sense of community, of belonging, of alignment, and the fact that members aren't just customers, they're also sharing in that value that's flowing back locally. And I'd say that technology amplifies that. I wouldn't necessarily say that it replaces it, but I do think that sometimes that relationship between a member and their ownership can feel a little bit static and really driven by particular company announcements. So you might receive a statement once or twice a year on the finances, but it's not something that you necessarily interact with very often. And I think that's where modern technology can bring that ownership to life. So for many of the co-ops we support, that means moving ownership from systems that can be quite clunky, hard to access, and then onto a modern digital platform. And suddenly it becomes far easier for members to check the ownership details, often straight from their mobile phones. It's really visible, it's accessible, and it's something that people can be engaging with more regularly throughout the year rather than only at specific milestones. And so I do think that technology creates opportunities for more personal connection. And I guess, an example is even at those particular company milestones, let's say that you've got an annual report. Well, actually, with a mobile first experience, you can have, a message that comes up from the CEO, talking about the results. So there's just so many touch points where you can create more personalization, but in a way that really scales across, because often it's thousands or tens of thousands of members.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I guess, when people see that kind of mobile interface, they might often assume, hey, it's really sort of simple and straightforward. But I mean, I can imagine that the infrastructure that you've had to build underneath that must be doing a heck of a lot of work. And as you've said, the cooperative shareholding, it can be quite complex. I mean, shares could be held by family trusts or individuals or partnerships or farming businesses across generations as well. So what kind of had to happen behind the scenes at Sharesies to build a platform that's capable of supporting that kind of structure?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about working with cooperatives that you're well aware of, and I'm sure your audience is as well, is that there isn't just one model. Different sectors have different co-ops, and they're often really unique structures within that. And so the challenge is really understanding and working with that nuance. And that's where we do expect technology to do a lot of the heavy lifting. So if you take the dairy sector as an example, and you mentioned it, many farms are held through a trust or a company form. There's often multiple trustees involved, multiple owners involved, and that actually raises quite practical questions around access and visibility. Who should be able to see the ownership? Who should be able to do certain things with the ownership? How do you handle different logins for different people connected to the same farm or entity, whether that's partners, husband, wife, family members, multiple owners? And then there's also the structure itself. So in some supplying co-ops, shares are linked directly to supply. In others, there might be minimums and maximum shareholding requirements or particular rules that members need to stay compliant. And so really part of that challenge is making sure those members can really easily see where they sit. Are they meeting those minimums or maximums? Do they need to adjust their shareholdings? Are they meeting some of the other co-op requirements? And really our focus has been to get the technology to absorb as much of that complexity as possible. So the underlying structures can be quite sophisticated, but the experience for the member should feel pretty simple and really intuitive.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the goal is that someone can open the app and very quickly understand the ownership, understand where they stand. And then the other piece, when you're thinking about building and when you have got a lot of complexity that you're grappling with, is we want to build in a way that is modern and maintainable. So we're not just building for today, but it is important we're building technology that can evolve with the co-op and continue to provide a really good experience over time. Because as you, I think, mentioned at the start, co-ops tend to last for a really long time. They have incredible tenure and a lot can change over 30, 40, 50 years or more. So how do we make sure that we're really remaining current over that time? But yeah, if I had to sum it up, it's like technology should do the heavy lifting. The structure can be complex, but the experience shouldn't be.
Yep. No, that makes a huge amount of sense. And I guess all of the work that you do supports a better brand experience, I guess, between Fonterra or LIC, for example, and their members as well. So it's a really great synergy. So, you talked about some of the complexity there. Did you hit any sort of technical or regulatory challenges in particular, or was that quite a streamlined process for you?
I mean, technology-wise, there's a lot of complexity to build for and really thinking about how that evolves over time. So we spent quite a long time really thinking through, all of those things and making sure that, in particular, yes, it met the requirements now, but as things evolved, how could that technology be maintained and improved over time and stay really current? Because the reality is that consumer expectations are just constantly rising when it comes to digital experiences. In terms of regulatory, one of the big advantages with us partnering with LIC and Fonterra is that they're listed on the exchange, and we've got a ton of experience working with listed companies, and we're an NZX market participant and sort of very used to that sort of environment. So that probably played into a lot of our advantage that we built up as being able to work with some of that regulatory infrastructure at scale.
Mm. And I guess, you've also talked about the engagement process. So, we've talked before about cooperatives and the members aren't just investors. They, depending on the type of co-op, they could be a supplier, they could be a customer, they might be a participant in the business itself. And so did that range of different types of, I guess, engagement with the co-op, did that create a different kind of engagement dynamic for you?
Well, the thing that we loved about it is it actually creates a much deeper engagement and a much deeper relationship because of those overlaps. And when you mentioned the brand before, it's like these members are often the strongest advocates because they are connected to the
Yeah,
co-op in
absolutely.
multiple ways. It's not just financially invested, it's their livelihood, it's their community, their companies, their entities, their land, and often their identity are connected to the organisation as well. And so that's a totally different engagement dynamic. I think one of the real advantages is that it means that members, I think, tend to take a much longer term view than possibly traditional shareholders. I know there's lots of shareholders that take really long term horizons, but if someone's investing in shares in a company, they might be focused on a 10-year, for 5-year, 10-year, 15-year view. But actually, let's take farming, for example. You don't buy a farm to be in the business for 5, 10, 15 years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's often multi-generational, and the decisions are made with that really long time horizon in mind. And I think the beauty of the co-op model is that members generally understand that alignment. And so, the goal is to maximize over very long time horizons. And the goal is not just to maximize the value of the co-op itself, but it's about how do you maximize the total value of that membership and that community around it, knowing that so much of that value is staying local. And I think that's definitely got to do with that resilience of the model as well that that you had mentioned. I think that being able to take that really long time horizon, you're really thinking about endurance, you're thinking about resilience, you're thinking about actually, there are times that are going to be tougher, but how do you actually withstand that? And I think being able to make sure you're bringing members along that journey and communicating that really well, as long as you're doing that, then generally I think you've got members that are on board for that.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. No, that makes complete sense. And so following on along the theme of the work that you've done with Fonterra and with LIC, what do you think the cooperatives themselves were looking to achieve? Like, what were their goals by working alongside you through this process?
Yeah, so if we start with Fonterra, we started talking to them a few years ago, and at the time they were at the end of making some quite significant changes to the capital structure, really to create more flexibility for farmers, and introducing those wider mins and maxes that farmers need to hold in the co-op. And a big part of their focus was asking, how do we make things, frankly, better for farmers who are members of the co-op? And as part of it, they were looking across, lots of ways that farmers experience being part of Fonterra. But one of the key touch points is share ownership, because it is a cooperative.
Mm-hmm.
And so then the question became, what should that ownership experience look like? And Fonterra wanted to move towards something that felt much more modern, accessible. A mobile-first experience was really important. Often farmers, they want to be able to do things on the go. They're really busy. How do we
Yeah,
empower that?
yeah,
Making things really well-designed, intuitive, easy for farmers to use, and something where they could quickly see their shareholdings, track share price movements, view market information, and then take any action if they need to. So really it was, how do we build a better ownership experience for farmers? With LIC, the thinking was pretty similar as well. It was all about making that experience of being a shareholder easier and more accessible. And there's a really high crossover between Fonterra and LIC farmers. And so one of the advantages of the platform is that then, people that are members of both entities, they can see shares in Fonterra, shares in LIC, all in the one place.
Yeah.
So ultimately, so the goal for both organisations was really quite simple. How do we create a much better experience for their farmers?
Yeah. And so do you yourselves as a platform get feedback from the farmer shareholders around, what their experiences are from the customer side?
Yeah, heaps actually. I mean, we love talking to farmers. It's been a segment that we have really enjoyed engaging with over the last 2 or 3 years. A lot of phone calls as well as other ways that we communicate with them. And we've seen really an overwhelmingly positive response from these communities. It's interesting. I think farmers get quite a bad rap as sort of not being strong with technology, and I just think that's not true. I mean, there's incredible innovation that I see on farm, and you look at the
absolutely.
But actually, we've seen farmers really, really loving the mobile first experience, being able to see things quickly, being able to engage quickly and take action. And we now see the vast majority of the Fonterra trading is now going through the Sharesies platform. And really, the remainder that's not is largely due to the market makers that are providing liquidity in that market. So, the evidence is that farmers are really engaging with it, and which is really pleasing to see. And I'd say the other thing is we're seeing it cater right across the board. So we're seeing members that might be really experienced with share trading, not just Fonterra shares, but lots of other shares. And we see the platform work really well for those segments. And we're also seeing it really work for farmers that might not hold any shares outside of the membership, but it provides a really simple, intuitive interface for them to be managing that part of their co-op membership.
And so you mentioned liquidity just before. So what do you think that simpler trading means for liquidity and flexibility for members?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty linked, because when it's easier for members to buy or sell shares, more people are willing to participate in the market, and then that increased participation is going to naturally improve liquidity because there are more buyers and sellers at any given time. And I think for members, the important thing with liquidity is it creates that flexibility, so they can adjust their shareholding more easily. They don't need to wait for particular liquid times of the market, so they can adjust as their circumstances change. So whether that's increasing their stake in the co-op or freeing up capital when they need it. In sectors like agriculture, farmers' circumstances can change so much with things like production levels, farm ownership structures, prices, weather. Farmers already deal with so much uncertainty that I think that flexibility is particularly valuable. And ultimately, making trading simpler helps the market function more smoothly, which actually benefits all participants, whether that's the individual members or the co-ops as a whole as well.
Yeah. And do you think, one of the challenges that it's not just for New Zealand, it's for cooperatives all around the world, no matter what kind of sector that they're in, bringing through the next generation of members, and succession planning, it really is a challenge. So, do you see that a platform like Sharesies business would help the newer generations of members engage with that kind of ownership differently, or think differently about their ownership?
100%. And actually, in the co-op report that you released last year, I was blown away around some of the statistics around, that generational transfer that's happening. We think about this $1 trillion wealth transfer that's just starting out in New Zealand, and we're seeing it, as you say, globally as well. So much of that is, I think, in that rural space, which tends to be co-op dominated. And I think there was a stat that something like around half of farms are going to be, changing to the next generation in the next decade. And so that is massive. I mean, it just has hugely significant impacts. And for the next generation, if it's not on their phone, it kind of doesn't exist. Younger members don't want a paper trail. They want to access digital dashboards that gives them, what they need when they need it at any time. And so, putting co-op ownership right next to other investments, really sort of joining the dots on what all of their wealth looks like, you turn sort of what is an ad hoc process into a daily habit. And I think something that's interesting is that a lot of the farmers that we serve that are sort of opening other accounts with Sharesies to, buy other shares or a save account or whatever it is, a lot of them are saying, oh, it's my children that are using Sharesies and sort of, show me how, or
Right. Okay.
and so I think the more that you can get those different generations engaging with it together, and sort of giving them common language and common technology to use, I think the more that we can encourage those conversations, the better it is in terms of thinking about that wealth transfer.
Yeah.
Because wealth can be awkward to talk about. It can be, when you're thinking about inheritance or you're thinking about next generation, sometimes those things are hard and can be awkward. And the more that we can use technology to help with those conversations and to help make things more transparent and more visible and more accessible, I just think the better that's going to be for everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. No, totally agree. And I think, you mentioned how difficult it can be, but there's also so many assumptions being made, right? I guess
Yeah.
between maybe a recipient and somebody that might be passing on their wealth. So again, as you said, that transparency can really help break down some of those assumptions and get people on the same page early on. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, anything can help to promote those conversations, and that's right. Promote visibility, take the awkwardness out, the better.
Mm. Right, I'd like to pivot a little bit now to the Orchestra platform. So Sharesies business acquired Orchestra, and I know that we do have several New Zealand co-ops that use Orchestra for shareholder registers and for comms. So how does Orchestra fit into the broader vision for supporting member-owned organisations?
Yeah, Orchestra, which we've actually rebranded now to Sharesies Private, was a really important strategic move for us around doing more in the unlisted space. So we were already working a lot with listed companies, and that included LIC and Fonterra that are on the New Zealand Stock Exchange. But actually, so many companies are not listed, and really our mission is to connect companies to the people who believe in them. So actually, we really want to broaden that out to be able to serve all types of organisations. And so that's been a really, really important part of our growth and our ability to be able to serve more, including in the co-op space. And there's a lot of co-ops that, will manage sort of their own ways for shares to be traded, and they're not listed on the exchange. And so when we acquired Orchestra have already been serving a bunch of different co-ops, which is only growing. So that's been sort of really great to think about, lots of different co-ops, particularly, outside of the agricultural space. I think it's easy to think of co-ops as rural, and actually there's so many companies, I think, that are, leveraging that co-op structure.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's certainly something that we see as an assumption that, co-ops are largely agricultural or horticultural. But yeah, as you said, in fact, we've got some, really large organisations in multiple sectors that have chosen the cooperative structure for decades and decades. So yes, totally agree. And do you have an opinion on the role that really good shareholder communication plays in governance now that you have moved into the Sharesies Private, as you said, Orchestra has been rebranded to, and the Sharesies business side?
Oh, I mean, good shareholder communication is just key. And I think that communication could be seen as this soft skill, and actually it is this rock hard skill. It's really, really important. And I think that with good communication, cooperatives and companies and any organization can actually do much more. As long as you're actually bringing members or bringing investors or shareholders or employees along the journey, actually there's a lot of different things that you can do. I think with governance, it's just pivotal. I mean, I don't think you can have good governance without really, really strong communication. And I think that, I don't think that digital communication entirely replaces everything else. I think it's really about having both. It's really about meeting members where they are and finding different ways to communicate. I think that's why communication is really challenging, because everyone likes to be communicated differently. Everyone has different needs.
Yeah.
And so, how do you think about that as an organization at scale? And how do you find different ways to communicate based on those different segments? Often I like the saying that communication is measured at the listener's ear, not the speaker's mouth. But
I
that's
like that. Yes.
when it's one to many, that's really, really challenging. So I think it's about, how do you leverage those different channels so that it does resonate with a huge variety of members, which ultimately, a co-op with that broad ownership is going to have. So I think it's in person, but it's also digital. It's working out, an annual report can be helpful, but it's also incredibly long and once a year, and often very much about the past rather than maybe what's very current or the future. So
Sure.
how do you, are there other ways that you can use sort of more bite-sized information more regularly? Is it a monthly update that can be, an app notification or an email that gets sent through? What are the other ways that you can be thinking about more dynamic and more regular communication that meets members for what they want?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's so true. People are at the heart of cooperatives, and cooperatives only exist when people get together to solve a common problem. So they're incredibly invested in the actual cooperative itself, as you said. And, people may have been shareholders or cooperative members for 50 years or 5 years. So I guess the range of experiences needs to be met by the range of communication methods, as you've described. Yeah.
That's right. And it is, one of the great things with technology is it does help that scale. One of the challenges with broad ownership is it's, how do you do that sort of one-to-many communication and also get feedback from the many back to the organization. When I think about some of the listed companies we work with, it's quite easy to engage with institutional investors. You'll have one-on-one meetings, it's only a handful. That's quite simple to do in a sort of in-person and one-on-one way. But when you've got, say, thousands or tens of thousands of other shareholders,
Yeah.
you can't just set up one-on-one meetings or else, you wouldn't be able to actually run the company. So that's where technology can come in that can often replicate what might be a one-on-one situation, but doing that for, a much broader group of people.
Mm. All right. This has been a very interesting conversation. So what I'm going to do now is sort of pivot to the future. So obviously it's always incredibly tricky to predict, but so rather than specifics looking ahead, what is the area or the areas that excites you personally most about the role that tech could play in supporting member ownership in the future?
Yeah, I think what excites me most is that ability to make ownership easier, more accessible, and far broader. I think in New Zealand, we often focus heavily on wage growth, especially at an individual level. It's always about what's my wage, what's my salary. And I totally appreciate that is very important in paying the bills or paying rent or paying a mortgage or whatever that is. But long-term wealth creation is generally not done through wage growth. It's done through ownership and it's done through profit sharing. And that's where I think models like cooperatives are really powerful because they allow value to be created and shared and more importantly, kept locally within a community. But the challenge is that some of those ownership structures can be quite complex to manage. So that's where I get excited about technology, is that it can absorb a lot of that complexity and make those models much easier to run and participate in. So, my hope really is that as technology continues to improve, it just becomes far easier for organizations to pursue models like a cooperative model and really broad-based ownership. Because I think that when people have a stake in the success of the organizations around them, that has so many other benefits and really helps create much more robust communities as well. It's interesting, actually. I was talking to a director who is from the US and has moved to New Zealand, and they observed that, in New Zealand we are so obsessed with the base salary or the fixed salary, whereas in the US, if you're a middle manager or above, you're always talking about your incentive. What are the shares that you're getting, or what's that ownership look like? And I do think, if we really want to be really optimistic about creating long-term wealth, and that is really important for actually having good choices. I mean, it's not about just hoarding money, but ultimately wealth gives us choice to build great infrastructure, build world-class healthcare, build great education, help build resilient communities, all the things that we want. Then actually we really need to be thinking about what actually creates that long-term wealth. And I think that's where ownership is so important. So anything that technology can do to support that being much more broadly shared, I just think it's going to have really, really positive ripple through effects for our country.
That's awesome. I love that as a way to end. And we did. You mentioned the report that we commissioned last year, and we did describe in there that far less value drifts offshore in a cooperative model, and in the current economy, that's incredibly important. We're looking to Scotland, for example, where they've just passed a community wealth building bill, and that is even another step forward, right? So I think there's definitely some things that we here in New Zealand can look to and aspire to bring that community wealth building through, and ownership is absolutely one of them.
Because there's this big capital recycling effect too. It doesn't just stop at that individual or that member. With that, then money is recycled through the community over and over again.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was thinking about, because I didn't actually realize that you could get employee-owned cooperatives as well as another structure. Learned
Yes,
that through
yeah.
reading the report. But I do think of some of the big success stories of companies in New Zealand that had broad employee ownership. Like Trade Me, like Xero, they have funded other new companies or other new organisations through
Yeah,
those employees doing well, and then be able to recycle that capital locally.
yeah.
And so the more that we can do that, it's just this snowball effect that really keeps on giving. So yeah, I think that we need to absolutely be looking at models to keep value in those communities, because it doesn't just stop at that; it just keeps being recycled, for the future.
Amazing. Well, that is a fantastic place to close. Thank you so much, Susannah. I really appreciate your time. It's been a incredibly interesting conversation, and one of the themes that definitely came through for me is that co-op ownership is an experience, and it's an experience for members that really does transcend, the ownership model itself. And also that tech now has the ability to make that experience so much clearer and so much more accessible and much more engaging. So Susannah will be joining us as a speaker at our 2026 Leaders Summits, where we'll explore the future of capital and member ownership in much greater depth. Thanks for listening to Co-op Leader Conversations.